Well, welcome to another episode of Beyond the Youth Room podcast. We are excited to dive into an important topic today about competing with sports. So, our youth ministries, often on weeknights or other activities, may compete with our youth ministry programming. So, how should we view this, and why or when should we step in and address this with students that might be playing sports? So, let's take a dive into this topic today. Now, thank you so much again for joining us. We are sponsored by Edge Clubs, and you can actually have access to our free student missionary training. It can be taught in one large session. It's an hour long of teaching training, or you can divide it into three different sections over 3 different weeks or 3 different gatherings. And you have full 100% free access to that over at edgeclub.org/training. And we'd love for you to participate in that. We have nothing to sell you. We want to make sure that that's clear because, like, we've
Yep.
seen like tons of other people. They're like, "What are you like? What are you doing this for? Like, what do you like?" Listen, we literally are creating content and resources for youth leaders so that they can advance the gospel in their own context. And we want to make sure that everything that we provide is free of charge, and we want to benefit from them freely. So
Yep.
there's nothing to sell you.
Nope.
Just go participate in it. Let us know if there's anything that we can create that would be more helpful for you.
Yep. Absolutely.
That's the only charge. That's the only charge. Now, today's topic is one that we've seen on some of the youth group or the youth ministry groups
Yeah.
come up a lot. In fact, you kind of raised this question of what are some of the obstacles in ministry right now that you're facing, and this was a very common one that people reported back to us, saying, "Listen, there's so many competing activities in sports." Where during COVID, that was not the case.
Yeah.
Like we literally there was like nothing going on, so it was a lot easier to engage students. When everything was kind of shut down activity wise. But now that we're on the backside of that, and over that, there's lots of different commitments to sports and activities and extracurricular activities, and that is it's not anything new, although it's increased recently,
Yeah.
since COVID. But realistically, that's been an issue for a long time in youth ministry. So you have a little bit of experience this because you grew up in the church,
Hmm.
you loved the Lord, and you also played sports.
Hmm.
So your personal experience might benefit this discussion today. So when it comes to now, as a teenager, I was committed to our youth group and was also involved in sports. But there was never like a big conflict there because like we played on. I was a football player in high school, so we played on Friday nights. We had youth group on Sunday nights and I think sometimes Wednesdays and stuff. But it wasn't like so it wasn't like a decision that I had to make.
Hmm.
But for you specifically, you're pretty committed to sports. In fact, you played college baseball, and so that puts you in like a different level of excellence than I ever was because I never played in college. But when it comes to sports and youth group and the competing activities, share a little bit about your background and your kind of unique advantage in describing this as well now as a youth pastor.
Yeah. So I grew up in the church and grew up. My mom was a pastor's kid, and so and then my dad had come from a really just unfortunate home situation, and so he resolved church we're gonna put God number one, and nothing else is gonna come before that. So I was really blessed by that. But when it came to sports, we had differing opinions than a lot of my teammates and a lot of my friends. And so baseball is kind of the sport in my house. And so I didn't really have a choice of whether or not I was going to play baseball. It was just kind of pursuing it. And thankfully, my parents never forced me to pursue sports I didn't want to. But yeah, around the start of middle school, actually, I kind of moved out of Little League like every other kid and said, okay, this kind of seems to be something that I want to pursue at a, maybe at a higher commitment level. And so I remember we were looking at travel teams, and this is a total. If you need an example of if God wants you to do it, He'll open doors for you to do it. This was that. We were looking for travel teams to try and kind of get a little bit more, but we wanted to stay local because my parents had said, you're in middle school. We're not gonna skip church on Sundays to go travel around, the East Coast playing games. Like that's not even necessary right now. That there might be pressure from other people to do that, but that that's not, you don't need to do that in order to excel as a baseball player. And so we were praying about what that looks like, and there was no lie, it still exists. There was a travel team that's home field was right across the street from our church. And so I would literally go to the first service. I would go into the bathroom at church and change into my uniform, and I'd jump in the car. We'd drive the 30-second drive across the street, and I would show up late for warm-ups, but I would be able to be on time for the game. But we had decided we're never going to miss church because of a game. So that's kind of what middle school was like. But then high school came around, and that kind of wasn't really a possibility anymore, because now at the point that I was pursuing, we thought, okay, college is kind of a realistic opportunity if this is something that we want to pursue. Now we're going away for the weekend and we're staying in hotels to play sports, and we're practicing and things like that. And so what we did is, as we went on the road, we still always went to church. Depending on when our game schedule was, in the town we were in, we would find an 8 a.m. service, and we'd look up their doctrine, the night before, and be like, okay, here's where we're going.
Yeah.
And so we went there. If we had an early game, then we would find a later service, and so my parents said, no matter where we are, church is going to be a priority. Now, this is before services were streamed online and things like that, but we said this was going to be our priority. But the deal was, we booked it home on Sunday so I could be back for youth group. And Wednesday night youth group wasn't even a negotiable. Like, I would show up just dirty and sweaty after practice, like in my uniform, and show up to youth group.
Yeah.
So it was something that you can do both, because if God, has given you the ability and the desire, and you honor him with it, you're going to do both, but you're going to have some really hard conversations. Yeah. And as youth leaders, this can be a really frustrating topic for us as well, because we kind of see it as a competing element. And my desire is, at the end of the podcast today, that we wouldn't see it as a competing element. We would see it as a decision that has to be made, and each family kind of has to make that decision for them. And there are definite rights and wrongs within that. But my hope is that we don't view ourselves as competing with, sports, because the gospel doesn't have to compete with anything.
Yep. Yeah. And so with that, over the years, we've had students that have kind of asked this question to us, like, genuinely wanting like
Yeah.
a kind of a biblical response, of, and it's not easy, right? It's not always like a clean cut, like, oh yes, like, 100% you should never, sacrifice, a sports, developing like aspirations or whatever for, church. And so we have some guidelines from scripture of, like, obviously living out the one another's of the body of Christ. Like, we shouldn't avoid Christian community altogether. Like, it's like,
Hebrews, do not neglect the meeting
yeah,
of the
do
body
not
of
neglect
believers.
meeting together as believers. And so we want to make sure that we're upholding that. But then now, like, there's so many different options for that. Like, it gets kind of hairy. It's like, okay, well, what if I come to church, but I don't come to youth group anymore for a season because I'm doing sports? And I would just say, like, it's not always a clean cut like answer.
Yeah.
But I would say it can be dangerous, if you're not involved in that Christian community and that growing, developing. Now, and this is one thing that we were both talking about too, about how, attendance doesn't always equal godliness.
Mm-mm.
So we have students that we know are attending
They're
that
there
aren't
all the
godly.
time. Yeah.
But they're not godly. And so in the same sense, like, and I used to have this attitude of, like, and when I first started here at McLean, um, we used to, I mean, it was like a thing. And now to, like, look back on that, like, we would never do that now. It's so funny that we were so dogmatic about it. But we saw, even like, if students, because we had services that were simultaneous, like, we had youth services simultaneous as our adult services. So, like, you would come to our Rock Student Ministries at the same time your parents were in the main service, and we kind of siloed ministry out like that, which we don't really do that much anymore. But I remember we would, like, give kind of like scowling looks to teenagers that we saw walking into the service. Like, instead of coming to our student ministry service, it's like, yeah, how dare you? Like,
Yeah.
and it was like a thing where we'd actually try to encourage them, like, and try to get them to come down. And we saw it as like an act of rebellion, like, to attend like another service instead of our, and it was, of course, it was kind of silly. But when it comes to attendance, yeah, we just, students can still grow in their faith
Yeah.
and can still flourish even without attending youth group per se. Again, like, there's some dangers in, like, not being around a Christian
Absolutely.
community or accountability, and so that for the right reasons. So in other words, if they just don't like the accountability of living out God's word, that's why they don't come anymore. That would not be for the sake of, like, that wouldn't
Yeah.
be like a direct connection to, it could grow. But what I found is, not in the competing sense, but what I've observed is that teenagers want to be challenged. Many teenagers want to be challenged
Mhm.
with something hard.
Yeah.
And I think overall, this is, of course, generalization, but I think overall we don't challenge students enough
Mm.
to compete in that sense with the
Yeah.
challenge that they'll get from sports or the
Yeah.
challenge that they'll get from being in the band or academic challenge or extracurricular activities.
Mhm.
And so I think there's something that we can learn from that the team aspect of walking through something hard together
Mhm.
is something that we don't utilize enough in youth ministries, to where
Yeah.
when we give them a reason to be part of something bigger than themselves, I really think that there is, sometimes a choice to understand, like, okay, like I want to be a part of this instead of this. When they have eternal like perspective, then yes, I could be part of this hard thing. But um, yeah, so I would say one, call them to a greater challenge,
Mhm.
and I think you'll have more committed students that regularly attend and give them a reason to be there. Like, in other words, if it's just the same thing every week, like there's nothing but like there's no like obviously we don't want to cater to like we can't really compete with the world as far as entertainment and all that
Mhm.
stuff. But we can really outshine the world when it comes to genuine community. Like there should be like a sense of community within your youth ministry to where people from the outside are like, how is that possible? Like
Yeah.
how is that even like how can they all get along when everybody else out, like in my public school or whatever, or my friend circle, like they're in fight, they're fighting against each other, they're gossiping, like they're we shouldn't be reflective of that.
Mhm.
We should be different in the sense that it's so desirable for other people
Yeah, we need
to be
we
part of that.
yeah, another way to say that is kids wanna play sports because they understand the value that they can get out of it, and maybe we need to be better at, showing the value proposition of being faithfully attending a youth group about the impact that it can have on those students and the impact that those students can have on those around them. So and one thing I do wanna say, as we dive into, like, not competing, I do wanna validate some of our youth leaders' concerns. From somebody who was
Mhm.
in it and now still is involved in baseball, the demands have gotten greater.
Right.
When I was in playing sports, it was like a couple nights a week, right? Now I'd work with kids who they have baseball literally every
Every day.
night of the week, year round.
Wow.
And so it's not so much of, oh, I'm not going to be here for baseball season, but then I'll be back. That's not really the case anymore. So I do want to validate,
Yeah,
if you're
it's gotten
struggling and
worse.
saying,
Yeah,
hey,
or
this
it's
is
gotten
this
more
has gotten
intense.
more, just demanding, you're correct,
Yeah.
and this Sunday used to kind of be a day that everybody kind of recognizes like, okay, we're going to
Mhm.
kind of, hey, we're not going to do this, but that sadly in our culture, Sunday is no longer owned by the church; it's owned by the NFL.
Mm.
And so as you look at these things, we can kind of rail against it, or we can say, hey, we're gonna get creative and continuing to invest. We're gonna keep the Sabbath holy,
Mhm.
by not neglecting to meet with the body of believers, but we're gonna continue to say, okay, how can the gospel go forward in the culture we're in without diluting the gospel?
Yeah. Well, and I think that brings up a good point too of really helping them to see the eternal perspective, like helping families to see that, like because
Yes.
they're ultimately like it's not like a kid's like taking themselves to practice every
Hmm.
day, and like I mean, there's a family commitment level there
Yeah.
too. And I was just thinking of this question in perspective of my own family. So I've got four boys,
Hmm.
and they're getting involved with activities, and we just went through a season I shared with you of we had overcommitted ourselves to so many different things with our church commitments. My wife and I are both in ministry, and so when it comes to like, in other words, for us, if one of our boys was thinking about joining some kind of team, and there was game or practice on Sunday, we would just say impossible.
Yeah.
Like just based on like our level of commitment to local church, like
Yeah.
we could not physically even do that.
Hmm.
And yes, I mean it's decided already. Like for like it's in other words, like it's not like a well, let's see if we can do this. It's
Yeah.
like no, that's already a thing that's we're so we're so involved with the local church that we couldn't see another thing
Hmm.
added to that day or whatever. So for some families, like I think there's like a well, should I do this? And I had a conversation recently with a dad whose son is good at baseball and he's and he was wrestling. He's like, hey, should I have him play on this travel team that plays on Sundays and he'd miss church every Sunday. And he was really wrestling. He's like, but if I don't, then he won't develop into that like role where he'd have more access to better players and better coaches and so we think that he might be good enough to play college one day or high school and maybe get scholarship and all that stuff. So there's like that kind of hope for their child. But I think the reality is, and I've talked to different parents of this over the years, is what is it, like 1% of high school players get scholarships? Like,
For Division 1, it's 1.2, and people need to understand that it financially it's not an investment.
Yeah.
Financially, it doesn't even out. So those are great things to share with parents as well, to dive
Yeah.
into those and help them see
Say
it's be
like,
like,
okay, you have this limited time.
hmm
Is this what you're going to be about instead of investing in the rest of their life? Because like you played college ball,
hmm
but that's not what defines your life now.
no,
Like, in other words, but you spent a significant amount of time, even with that good balance of like,
hmm
still not missing church.
yeah,
And so I would just say to parents, that you have to realize like, okay, what are you going to sacrifice your time and energy and their time and like their some of the most formative years of their life
mhm,
for the sake of something that might happen? And if it does happen, will it actually impact the rest of their life? Like, the chances of them going MLB or
yeah,
NFL, like, or NBA are very slim as well. Even like a smaller pool of D1 schools,
yeah,
do they get to play in major league? And so when it comes to that dream of getting a scholarship or going professional or whatever, it could all fall apart if their physical body falls apart, right?
mhm,
If they're one injury away from ruining the rest of their career.
mhm,
But then when that happens, that's why you see so many different players that, like, it's been their identity for so long,
mhm,
and then when it's taken away or they retire, they're like, "Who am I? Like, I
yeah,
don't even know what to do now. Like, I don't have any spiritual foundation to my life. I don't have any,
mhm,
basis for, like, my identity outside of this sport or this activity." And so I would say, yeah, so you have a limited amount of time, with the teenagers. And so for families, like to coach them on saying, hey, are we going to be so devoted to this that we're not going to build that spiritual foundation for when those things pass away? Eternity will still matter and still
yeah,
be relevant, like, no matter what we've spent our time doing. And so I found that like even with students though deciding, because we often know like if a teenager doesn't want to come, it's very difficult continuously for the parents to bring them.
yeah,
Like, if they're literally like, "No, I don't wanna come every single week,"
mhm,
it's gonna wear down the parents of, like, saying, "No, we're committed to this," like, so part of that is, like, we wanna make sure that they wanna come, like, to give them a desire to be a part of something bigger, so to challenge them to a greater challenge, like we talked about, so, involving them to something hard, so, like, memorize scripture together, like, train in godliness,
mhm,
just like you would an athlete, but for spiritual, conditioning. And then what I found is include them into a bigger story. We've talked about this with a bold vision of saying like, listen, if you don't participate in this, your friends' lives are at stake. Like, we want to see the gospel reached in our area, or we want to see this whole school hear the gospel from a friend. Will you be a part of that? And then that way, even if they are participating in sports, so we have some, like I have a high schooler right now in our youth ministry that is a very committed wrestler,
mhm,
and but he's just made it clear to his coach, hey, I'm still going to youth group on Wednesday nights. I'm still going to camps. He came to both of our winter camps. So he came as a student on our high school camp, and they came to serve in our middle school camp, and he missed two tournaments as a result of that. And he made it clear to his coach up front. He's like, "Hey, like I'm committed to this, and if I get benched or whatever, like because of this, like so be it. But just know that like it's already a decision I've made." And his coach was like, "I respect that." Like he and so with that, we have a bigger story that he can be part of, or that students can be part of. And if we're just communicating, youth ministry as okay, let's just meet together until you graduate or die. Like it's really like there's no real like energy behind
Or
like
if youth group is only those 2 hours on Wednesday nights, well, then if
yeah,
you miss those 2 hours because you're in a sports season, well, then what are you even doing here?
yeah,
And that's why painting that picture for families and students is so much bigger. So again, we take it off of, well, sports is on Wednesday night, youth group's on Wednesday night. It's just this. It's like, we understand we want to get them involved in a place that's going to,
mhm,
invest in them spiritually. But we want to take the conversation higher to say, what's your end goal for your kid?
yep,
If you gain the whole world and lose your soul,
mhm,
what was the value in it?
yep.
And I think that's the big thing.
Well, and also, like, when we see it as a menu versus a map, then
Yeah.
then it's just, like, whatever's more convenient or whatever I desire in that moment. So it's like, okay, do you want a nice fancy sit down dinner, or do you want McDonald's? Like, well, if I'm heading, home and I just need a quick bite to eat, I can't go to a fancy sit down dinner, like, it's more involved. So there's, like, competing like, if we just see it as, like, okay, these are 2 equals, what am I
Yeah.
gonna choose based
Correct.
on my limited time? It's like, no, 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 like, if we see, like, okay, we want someone to be prepared for godliness as an adult. How will we get there? Will
Yeah.
it be through baseball? Will it be through, of course, and some of those paths can simultaneously
Yeah.
go. In other words,
Absolutely.
like you were a baseball player and
Yeah.
you walked with the
Absolutely.
Lord as a teenager. So we, but I think if we present it as a consumeristic, like, what am I getting out of this? Or what,
Yeah.
what is like this menu aspect of like, okay, can I choose this or this? I think we can lose. We're on a losing ground,
Yeah.
when it comes to what students will choose. But yeah, I think those 3 points. Attendance does not always equal godliness. We want to call students to a greater challenge, which I think sports and activities are doing. That's
Yeah.
why they're so appealing. And if we do that within the church to make things hard, like growth, like spiritually training, I think it's going to include a lot more students that would otherwise be caught up in a challenge through sports, and then include them into a bigger story, realizing that eternity is at perspective when we are involved with youth ministry, like when we're involved in the church. Like we want to prepare you spiritually for the rest of your life, not just the short term gain of what am I getting out of this? Like, am I going to make friends here? Am I going to, to really build that long term thing? Okay, so resource that you recommend on this topic.
Yeah, I think there's a really cool topic because there's also people that you can point to. So if you're a youth leader trying to figure out how does this intersection of faith and sports work together, especially specifically with the NFL, you can look at Kirk Cousins, look up articles on him, articles on C.J. Stroud, Brock Purdy. All these guys are well known that a lot of your male athletes they're going to recognize too. You can kind of see that intersection, and they play on Sundays. So how does that work together? And they talk about that. But another place is it's actually in the YouVersion app. You can find it through FCA's website as well. But FCA is a great resource for this in general, partnering with athletes and the gospel. But they also have a 12-day devotional called Parenting Your Athlete, where again, as youth leaders, we're not parenting the kids, but it's a great way for you to kind of see, hey, how do these things work together, and how can we make this work for the benefit of the gospel ultimately? It's a great resource for that.
Yeah. All right, so I have some rapid fire questions for you. Okay, so a couple here. Do you allow students to be student leaders if they can't come to youth group for all of a sports season?
No, because we do a little bit differently.
Okay.
And they sign a contract saying that they will attend
A contract?
Well, it's an enlistment form. We talked about this in a previous episode, student leaders.
That's right.
I think it's episode 13. Actually, I don't know why that's sticking out to me, but episode 13, you can go back and
number 13.
podcast that. No, they have to meet so many times to do that.
So there's an expectation that you set for students that they have to attend a certain amount of times.
Correct.
And that equals godliness.
No, it equals commitment.
Yes, it equals commitment. Yeah. Which we just described, that attendance does not equal godliness.
Yep.
Yes. Okay. All right. So you would allow student leaders if they can't come, or no, you would not allow student leaders if they can't come because you have that outlined in your student leader commitment.
Correct. They could still serve in other capacities, but in terms of that program, no.
Okay. Is it okay for students to play sports on Sunday and just watch the service online afterwards?
Yes and no.
Because now, I mean, like since COVID, like
Absolutely.
everybody has an online service just
Absolutely.
about. Like, I mean, so that's a temptation to say, oh, well, we don't need to go. We're just going to watch it online or catch it, on podcast later or whatever.
Yeah. Here's the biggest thing I've ever, the greatest online service does so many good things, right? To reach people who maybe can't be there, or to reach people who haven't heard the gospel. And we know every person who checks out a church, they've already watched online services. So it does a lot of good. Here's the problem. You can't serve from your couch. And so
you're really not in the game if
correct,
you're just watching online.
Correct. You're not really part of the body of believers. Now, if a kid is going to go to a game anyways on Sunday, is it better for them to watch the online service than not watch service? Yes.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and I would say it's supplemental.
Yes.
But like I love it was like a Babylon Bee article. It's of course like a funny
you're gonna get us canceled.
Satire. Satire. But it was basically comparing. It's like it was like man joins Universal Gym but refuses to work out at his local gym.
Yeah.
And in essence, like the local church is the expression that we live in the biblical community of faith, and we serve in the biblical community, like we are part of the body of Christ. So yeah, I would say online service is usually just, I mean, it should be just supplemental. Like it's not, it's like, okay, I'm sick for the weekend, so I'll watch online. But yeah, you can't really participate in the biblical community of faith like by just watching a service. Like I think that and of course you can learn from God's word, like you can participate in worship and somewhere, like even if you're in the living room. But I would say that should be just supplemental, like not like a long-term plan.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So student questions, we're going to do a minute-long student question where I'm going to ask you a common student question, and then you're going to try to answer in 1 minute. Do you have your,
here we go.
Your timer?
This is my one job.
Okay. So now, this one I have not prepared. The one that you're going to ask me, I haven't prepared it in a minute. So I don't know. I'm going to try to keep it concise.
I'm cutting you off after a minute.
You just cut me off. But for this one, for you, Yeah, I don't know. Have you practiced this?
No, but
Okay, all
go
right.
for it.
Okay, so this one is a common question that we get from students that we're going to answer, and this is for two reasons. So, one, youth leaders, maybe you can learn from something that we, by answering this question over and over again, we've learned that might help you. But maybe you're a student and you're watching this, or you've come across this, and you want to know the answer to this question. So, the question is, you ready to start the timer?
I
Okay.
started
All
it.
right. The question is, when do music or movies become inappropriate or sinful?
Yes. So this might be the number one question I get right now from kids. It's a hard answer, but it's an easy one. If we used to grow up with two headphones. If Jesus listened to it with you, would you feel comfortable? If Jesus watched it with you, would you feel comfortable? Here's the reality. He is. If you're a Christian, Jesus goes with you everywhere you go, and you are his hands and feet. And so if you can watch it or listen to it, and you wouldn't feel embarrassed if you invited Jesus over to watch it or listen to it with you, then most likely then that's not something that is sinful. Great tip, by the way, students. Don't get lost in the beat of music. Look up the lyrics and read them without the music. You'll get a very clear picture of whether or not that it's edifying to your mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Good answer. I would say also, just to add to that too, like, if you're not really understanding, the concept of Jesus always watching or listening to
Mhm.
stuff with you, if you had that accountability of, like everything that you watched would be played in front of your parents or even your youth group
Your
or your
grandma's the one
church
I
or your
always hear.
grandma, like, in other words, like, oh, I mean, there could be things where, yeah, your grandma is watching more inappropriate things than you are, which,
Not my grandma.
okay, well, my grandma is like the sweetest lady ever, and we love her so much. There was a time where she watched our boys every Tuesday while we came to work, and so we were watching family movie night, and it was a clean movie, but there was a point where it was like a husband and wife like kissed each other, and our oldest son looked at us and said, "Are they going to take off their clothes now?" And we said, "What?" He was like 4 at the time. Like, we were like, "What are you talking about? What?" And we're like, where did you even learn that?" And so we kind of probed the question of like, what, like, how do you even know that that's connected? Like, where did you see this? Like, and yeah, I'm like, is this on a car? I was like, what cartoon did you
What
watch?
was the movie? What was the movie?
He said, I saw these on Nana soap operas. So she was watching a soap opera just for like a half an hour or whatever while she was watching them. That was the only time. Yeah. She was like, and that was actually a thing that we agreed to. Like, she was, when we said, "Hey, can you watch them for the day while we go to work?" She's like,
Nah,
"As long
only
as
if
I
I
can
can watch
still,"
Days of My
well,
Lives.
she's like, "As long as I can still watch my soap opera." We're like, "Yeah, no big deal. Like, just have the toys, have the kids play with the toys, whatever." And so anyway, so I bring that up is your grandma may not always have the same
That's
standards.
why I said Jesus.
Yeah.
That's why I said.
So yeah,
Okay.
if you're walking with Jesus,
Well, that
what
is
do
a
you watch?
perfect segue to the question I've got to ask you.
Yes. Okay. So what is the question that you're going to ask me?
All right. A student comes up to you and asks the following question: when should I start dating, and why should I date?
Or should you date?
Should you date?
Yeah. Okay. So my question or my answer to that is pretty simple. Pretty simple. Don't date for the sake of dating. Date for the sake of marriage. And so if you're not ready to consider that as like a potential spouse, then you shouldn't be dating. So I can say this from personal experience because I was 16 when I met my now wife, and we had that conversation as like crazy, advanced, mature believers. Somehow we said, "Hey, we don't want to just date to date. We want, like, could you consider, like, we don't know if we're gonna get married,
Yeah.
but if that's not even a possibility for the two of us to get married one day, then we shouldn't date at all." And we both were like, I think I could marry you one day, like, the Lord,
Yeah.
like following the Lord. And so we started dating. We dated for 5.5 years before we did get married. So I would say, if it's a distraction or if it's a thing where you just want a boyfriend or girlfriend for social status or for, selfish gain, then it's not the time.
Man, minute. Also, apparently, we have the same backstories as far as how we met our wives, but that's a
Yes.
podcast episode for a different time.
Maybe we should have them on sometime and talk about our being married to youth leaders or something.
No,
You don't think that would? You don't think that'd
it wouldn't paint me in a good.
Yeah, yeah.
No, I'm
Oh,
just
man.
kidding. No, it's all good. But yeah, that'd be a fun episode. Maybe
Well,
we'll
that concludes our episode. Yeah, we're just gonna cut that off right there and just be like, no. Yeah, I've got nothing to hide. I can bring
I don't
my
have
wife on
anything to
that,
hide
yeah.
either. It's just like what it's like being married to a youth director.
Yeah.
That
That
would
would be
be
challenging. Yeah.
yeah.
Yep. Will you guys spend like Valentine's Day weekend, at a winter camp or something? That might be a
All
reality.
expenses paid
All expenses
vacation.
paid, date night.
Weekend retreat.
Weekend retreat. Yeah. So, anyways, we are concluding this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, if you want access to our student missionary training, you can go over to edgeclub.org/training, and it's 100% free. We have nothing to sell you. If you have gotten value out of these podcasts, we'd love for you to like and share and follow and subscribe or whatever platform. It really helps more people see it. And if you share personally with other people, invite them in to view our content, we would appreciate that as well. So thank you so much for tuning in.